On the 29th of November, 1776, a French naval officer stepped onto an island that every chart called empty. It was not a large place, a ridge of coral sand in the Indian Ocean, a little under a mile long, with no trees and no fresh water on its surface. Ships kept away from it. The maps marked it as a hazard and nothing else. The officer found 7 women there. He found something else with them. A baby, 8 months old, alive. That child changes the whole story. A shipwreck leaves bodies and broken timber. It does not leave a healthy infant, born on the sand, 15 years after the wreck. A baby means a community. It means people who were still living, still bearing children, still keeping each other alive, long after the world had closed the file on them. They were not lost. That is the first thing the evidence makes clear. About 60 people had been put on this island on purpose and then left behind. More than 200 years later, archaeologists dug into that sand. They found the walls of houses built from coral. They found a well. They found copper cooking pots, cut and hammered and riveted back together, some of them mended as many as 8 times. Every repair is a season survived. Every rivet is a decision to keep going. This is not a story that begins and ends with a storm. The storm lasted one night. What came after lasted 15 years, and it was made by people, by a crew that built a boat and sailed away, by a promise, by an administration that heard that promise and did nothing with it, over and over, across 15 years. The survival stories ask how anyone could stay alive on a sandbar that long. There is a better question, and the record keeps pushing it forward. Why did no one come for them? Who decided these people were not worth a ship? And how did that decision almost disappear from the record completely? For careful history told from the documents, not the myth. Consider subscribing. To answer any of it, we have to go back before the wreck. Back to a beach in Madagascar in the middle of 1761 and to a ship that was never supposed to be carrying these people at all. Foulpointe sits on the east coast of Madagascar. In the 1760s, it was a trading post, one of several places along that shore where French ships came to buy human beings. The people bought there were not a single people. Madagascar is enormous, larger than France, home to many communities with their own rulers, languages, and rivalries. The men who sold captives on that coast, among them the powerful confederations of the eastern shore, were often selling prisoners of war, or people seized in raids further inland, or those handed over to cancel a debt. To the French buyers, none of that mattered. A person from the highlands and a person from the coast, strangers or even enemies in life, became the same single word once they were carried aboard: slave. The trade took a whole island of distinct peoples and flattened them into one category of goods, then shipped that category east. Whoever these 160 were, whatever they had been at home, the ledger no longer cared. The buyers were not there for timber or spice. They were there for people, and the demand came from 2 small islands far out in the Indian Ocean, Isle de France and Bourbon, the places we now call Mauritius and Reunion. On the maps, they are specks. In the 1760s, they were the eastern edge of the French Empire, and they were hungry for labor. The islands grew coffee and grain, and would soon grow sugar. None of that reached a European table without hands to plant it and cut it and carry it. The planters wanted those hands cheap, and they wanted a steady supply. Madagascar was 400 miles to the west, close enough to reach, poor enough to raid for its own people. So the ships went, season after season, and came back loaded. The ship in this story was called the Utile. The word means useful. She belonged to the French East India Company, the great state-backed trading house that ran French commerce across this whole ocean. Her captain was a man named Jean de Lafargue. His first officer, the second in command, was Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet. Hold on to that second name. Of all the Frenchmen in this story, he is the one who behaves differently, and the record shows it. At Foulpointe, the Utile took on people. The figure that comes down to us is about 160 men, women, and children, bought and carried aboard and pushed below the deck. We should be honest about what that number is. It is an estimate. The people it counts were entered in the ship's papers the way a cargo is entered, as a quantity and a value, not as a list of names. That is not a small detail. It is the beginning of the problem this whole film is about. From the first hour, these people were recorded as freight, and freight is the kind of thing a ledger can afford to lose. It is worth seeing how sharp that contrast was. In the same voyage, in the same set of papers, the company recorded its trade goods with real care. So many muskets, so many bars of iron, so many lengths of cloth, so many silver coins handed over at Foulpointe to the Malagasy rulers who sold their neighbors and their captives into this trade. Every object had its own line. Every object had a price. The people had a total. That difference is not a quirk of old handwriting. It is a way of seeing, and it traveled with these captives all the way to the reef and past it. There was a reason the ships kept coming back, year after year, for more. The plantations of Ile-de-France and Bourbon worked people to death. The climate was hard, the labor was harder, and the men who ran the estates treated a life as a thing to be replaced rather than kept. Under those conditions, the enslaved population did not hold its own numbers. It had to be topped up from outside, constantly. That meant a permanent demand. That meant ships like the Utile were never short of a reason to sail for Madagascar. The trade kept feeding a system that consumed the very people it delivered. There is one more fact about this voyage that matters more than any other, and it is easy to miss. This trip was against the rules. The French administration on Ile-de-France had forbidden it. The island was short of food that year, and the governor had ordered that ships coming from Madagascar carry grain, not slaves, so that the colony could be fed. Lafargue carried slaves anyway. He filled his hold with people the law said he was not allowed to bring. He was trading on the margins of what he was permitted to do, hoping the profit would settle the argument later. That single choice sets a trap that will spring 15 years down the line. When the survivors of this voyage need rescuing, the men who could send a ship will remember that the voyage was illegal in the first place. They will treat the people on the island not as castaways owed a duty, but as evidence of a crime someone else committed. The paperwork that should have protected them will instead be a reason to look away. But that is later. In that southern winter of 1761, none of it is visible yet. There is only a ship riding low in the water off Madagascar, 160 people in her hold, a crew of roughly 140 on her deck, and a captain in a hurry to be gone before anyone official asks what he is carrying. Think about the arithmetic of that hold for a moment. 160 people in a space built for barrels. No room to stand, little air, a ration of water measured out by the cup, because water is the one thing a ship at sea cannot make more of. People were chained in that dark for weeks at a time on crossings like this. Some did not survive the crossing at all, on any ship, in any year of this trade. That was understood. It was priced in. The Utile weighed anchor and turned east, toward Isle de France, toward the plantations that had ordered this human cargo. The distance was not great by the standards of the age. A week of decent sailing, perhaps 2. The captain had made such runs before. What he did not have was an accurate chart. Somewhere ahead of him, in open water he believed was clear, there was a low island almost no one had ever set foot on. It was so flat, so nearly at the level of the sea, that a lookout could miss it until the ship was on top of it. The French sometimes marked it on their maps. Often they did not. It had a plain descriptive name, the Isle of Sand, and it had killed ships before. The Utile was sailing straight for it, in the dark, with a captain who thought the way was open and a hold full of people who had no idea that the sea was about to decide their lives. To understand what happened on the reef, it helps to understand the ship and the men arguing on her deck. The Utile was a working vessel of the French East India Company, built to carry goods and people over long distances, not to fight and not to run fast. She was armed enough to discourage trouble and roomy enough to turn a profit. On this voyage, the profit was human, packed below, and the crew above numbered around 140. That is a crowded deck. It is also a great many mouths, each needing water every single day. Water is the quiet engine of this whole disaster. On a ship in these waters, in this century, fresh water was rationed from the first day out, because there was no way to replace it until the next landfall. Every extra body aboard drew the barrels down faster. The Utile was carrying 300 people all told, crew and captives together, across a stretch of ocean her captain expected to cross in a week or so. 300 people, one small ship, a week of water if nothing went wrong. All of that math depended on a fast, clean crossing, and the man in command had every private reason to rush it, and no honest chart to rush it safely. The pressure to hurry and the inability to hurry safely met in one person. The people in the hold would pay for the collision. The margins were thin. A few days of delay, a wrong turn, and the arithmetic of thirst would start to bite. A slave ship on a long reach was a place of sickness as much as of thirst. Bodies packed together in the heat, poor food, foul air below the deck, and the diseases that always traveled with this trade. People died on these crossings as a matter of routine, on every route, in every year, and those deaths were folded into the price, the way spoilage is folded into the cost of any cargo. The people below the Utile's deck were already, in the minds of the men above, a quantity expected to shrink before it was ever delivered. Sit with that for a second. It meant a certain number of these human beings had been priced, before they ever sailed, as acceptable losses. That pressure sat behind the decisions on the deck, and it helps explain the tension between the two men in charge. Captain Lafargue wanted speed. He had loaded an illegal cargo, and he wanted it delivered and sold before the problem could catch up with him. Speed meant holding a straight course and trusting the charts. His first officer, Castellan, was the more cautious man. The waters north of Mauritius were badly mapped, littered with reefs and low islands that appeared on one chart and not the next. Castellan wanted to slow down at night, to sail carefully through ground no one had properly surveyed. We know the shape of this disagreement because Castellan later wrote about the voyage, and his account is one of the reasons we can reconstruct any of this at all. He is not a neutral witness. A man describing a shipwreck he lived through has every reason to place the blame away from himself. But his account lines up with the physical facts of where the ship ended up, and it is the closest thing we have to a voice from the deck that night. There is a deeper reason the sea north of Mauritius was so dangerous. and it belongs to no single captain. In 1761, a ship could find how far north or south she was, with fair confidence, by measuring the sun at noon. Finding how far east or west she was, her longitude, was still close to guesswork. The instrument that would finally solve that problem was being perfected in these very years, but it was not yet in the hands of a company slave ship in the Indian Ocean. So Lafargue did not truly know where he was. He knew it the way a man reads the hour, from the length of a shadow, roughly, with the error growing the longer he sailed. A low island sitting in his blind spot did not need bad luck to sink him. It only needed him to be a little more to the east, or a little less, than he believed. By the last week of July, the Utile was somewhere north of Mauritius, in water the captain believed was open. The charts he trusted showed nothing ahead. The charts Castellan worried about showed a low smudge of danger, unconfirmed, easy to dismiss. Lafargue held his course. The ship ran on through the evening of the 30th of July and into the dark of the 31st, under sail, at speed, with a lookout straining to see a horizon that gave almost no warning. The island ahead did not rise out of the sea the way a coast does. It barely broke the surface. It was a flat ring of sand and coral, ringed by a reef that reached out under the water like a hidden wall. On a moonlit night, a sharp lookout might catch the pale line of surf breaking on that reef, and might have a minute or two to shout. On a dark night, there was no time at all. It was a dark night. We will come to the moment of the wreck itself in a moment, because the wreck is where the two groups on this ship, the crew and the captives, begin to be treated as two different kinds of people, with two different values placed on their lives. But hold the ship here for a second, in the last hour before it strikes, and notice what is true of everyone aboard. 300 people are asleep or awake in the dark, above deck and below. The 140 crewmen are sailors doing a job, badly paid, far from home, but free. The 160 in the hold are chained, sold, and counted as property, most of them taken from Madagascar within the past few weeks. They speak a different language from the men steering the ship. They have no idea where they are. They have been told nothing, because no one tells cargo anything. In the next few minutes, the sea is going to make no distinction between them. It is going to come through the hull for everyone. The distinctions that follow, who gets a place in the boat, who gets a promise, who gets left, will not be made by the sea. They will be made by men, on the beach, in daylight, with time to think. That is the part worth watching. At around 10 at night, on the 31st of July, 1761, the Utile ran onto the reef of the Isle of Sand at full sail. A ship under sail carries an enormous amount of energy. When she stops in an instant, all of that energy has to go somewhere. It goes into the hull. The Utile struck the reef and began to break apart in the surf. On deck, there was a chance. A sailor could grab a line, ride a spar, be thrown toward the shallows and the pale strip of sand beyond. Below deck, there was almost no chance at all. The captives were held in the hold, many of them chained or penned, in the dark, with the sea coming in fast through a hull that was tearing open beneath them. Most of the roughly 160 people who had been loaded at Foulpointe never got out of that hold. They drowned where they had been confined. That sentence is the whole moral weight of the wreck, and it deserves to be said plainly and then left to stand. Some did get out. In the chaos of the night, a number of the captives broke free, or were freed, and reached the water and fought their way over the reef to the island. By morning, when the survivors could finally count themselves on the sand, the shape of the disaster was clear. Of the crew, around 122 men had lived. Of the captives, the estimates run between 60 and 80. We do not have a firmer number than that, and the reason we do not is the same reason as before. Nobody with authority had ever written down exactly who these people were, so nobody could say for certain how many had survived. The record that treated them as a total in Madagascar could only give a total on the beach. Set the two figures beside each other. More than 100 crews saved out of 140. Perhaps 60 to 80 captives saved out of 160. The people locked below died at a far higher rate than the people who worked above, and they died for a simple physical reason. They were not free to move when the water came. When the sun rose on the first morning, it showed the survivors exactly what they had been left with. A low rim of sand and coral, the broken back of the ship in the surf, wreckage in the shallows, and, among it, the dead, and each other, soaked and injured and stunned, on ground so flat that a person standing at its center could see the sea on every side. No mainland showed on the horizon. No other sail. Whatever happened next would have to be built right here, out of what the wreck gave up, by the people the wreck had spared. And notice who that was. The people best able to build here were, in large part, the ones the ship had treated as property. They had arrived with nothing. They knew how to make something from nothing anyway. That skill was about to become the thin line between the whole camp and death. For now, it kept two groups alive together. Soon it would have to keep one group alive alone. Now look at where the survivors actually were. The Isle of Sand is not a refuge. It is a flat oval of coral and sand, low enough that a strong storm can wash across parts of it, with no trees, no shade, and no stream or spring anywhere on its surface. The first and most urgent problem was not food, it was water. A person can last weeks without eating. In that heat, without water, a person has days. There was wreckage, at least. The Utile had broken up in the shallows rather than sinking cleanly in deep water, which meant the survivors could wade out and pull things from her. Timber, barrels, iron fittings, sailcloth, casks of salvaged food, and crucially, some casks of fresh water that had not been fouled by the sea. Copper cooking gear from the galley. Lead sheeting the ship had carried for repairs. Tools. All of it dragged up onto the sand by exhausted people who had nearly drowned the night before. It is worth naming what came off that wreck, because much of it will surface again 2 centuries later, cleaned and catalogued by archaeologists. Copper pots and plates from the galley. Sheets of lead the ship had carried to patch her own hull. Iron bars and tools. Bricks. Kegs of nails. The Utile had been a floating warehouse, and now her contents lay scattered across a sandbar in the hands of the people she had wrecked. In the short term, it was survival gear. In the long term, it was raw material, and the distance between those two ideas is 15 years long. The dead had to be dealt with as well, the bodies that washed ashore or were pulled from the shallows, were buried in the sand. No ceremony was written down, no marker raised, no list of names taken. People who had been counted as a single sum in a ledger were now buried as a single sum on a beach. The sand kept them so completely that when archaeologists finally came looking, most of the graves were simply gone, scattered or built over by the survivors, who had no choice but to go on living on top of their own dead. And here, on the first day, the two groups began to separate. The French crew made their own camp. The Malagasy survivors were placed in another. From the very start, The men who had steered the ship organized the beach along the same line that had defined the voyage. One group gave orders and held the stores. The other group had survived the same sea, on the same night, and was treated as something less than equal to the men who had been carrying them to a life of bondage in the first place. The same water had spared them all. The same sand held them all. But the line drawn on the ship was carried straight onto the beach and kept there, because the men who held the stores and the tools were not about to let a shipwreck cancel the arrangement they had sailed out to enforce. Survival did not make the two groups equal. It just moved the inequality onto dry land. That division is going to matter enormously, because within days the French began to plan their escape, and the plan they built had room in it for some lives and not others. The first thing that happened once the shock wore off is that the man in charge fell apart. Captain Lafargue, who had held his course through the dark and put his ship on the reef, suffered what the accounts describe as a collapse of nerve. Whether we call it a breakdown or simply the failure of a man who could not face what he had done, the effect was the same. He stopped leading. Into that gap stepped his first officer, Barthélemy Castellan, and it is here that Castellan becomes the most important Frenchman in the story. Castellan was, by every measure we can apply, competent and hard driving. Under his direction, the survivors stopped waiting to die and started to work. They dug for water and they found it, sinking a well into the sand until it reached a supply fresh enough to drink. They built an oven and a forge from salvaged brick and metal so they could cook and shape iron. That forge deserves a second look because it shows how much skill was present on the beach. To work iron, you need heat, a way to force air into the fire, and hands that know what they are doing. The survivors had all three, and much of the heavy labor that built the camp, hauled the salvage, and raised the shelters was done by the Malagasy captives, kept at the work even as they were kept apart from the men they worked for. The competence that saved everyone in those first weeks was, in large part, theirs. It would still be theirs, and only theirs, once the French had gone. They organized the wreck salvage into something like a supply system. Within days, a camp of nearly 200 shocked and injured people had food, water, fire, and a plan. Hold on to those skills for a moment, because they are the hinge of the whole film. A well dug down to fresh water. A fire kept alive with wreck timber and flint. Metal cut and hammered into useful shapes. Shelter raised against the wind. These are the exact techniques that will keep people alive on this island for the next 15 years. What the French crew set up in a few desperate weeks, the abandoned captives will sustain and improve and depend on long after the French are gone. The knowledge did not leave on the boat. Some of it stayed on the sand, in the hands of the people who were left with it. But the plan Castellan drove toward was, from the beginning, an escape for the crew. The survivors began building a new boat out of the bones of the old one. They called her the Providence. She was small, a fraction of the size of the Utile, assembled from salvaged planking, and fitted out with whatever the wreck could give them. For roughly 2 months, through the late winter of the southern hemisphere, the beach was a shipyard. 2 months is a long time to share a small island with people you have already decided to leave. The French lived beside the Malagasy through all of it. They ate near them. They worked near them. They watched them haul timber for a boat that would carry only Frenchmen. Whatever was said in those weeks, the shape of it was fixed from the first day. One group was building a future. The other was building the thing that would strand them. The labor was brutal, and much of it was done by the Malagasy survivors, who hauled and lifted and built alongside the crew. They were building a boat that would not carry them. The Providence could not hold everyone. That much was true. She was a makeshift craft, and there were limits to how many she could take across open sea to Madagascar. But the way that limit was resolved tells you everything about how these two groups were valued. The French crew would board. The Malagasy would stay. The people who had helped build the only way off the island were told they would not be leaving on it. To soften that, or perhaps to quiet their own conscience, the French made a promise. They told the people they were leaving behind that this was temporary, that the Providence would reach Madagascar, and word would travel to Ile-de-France, and a proper ship would be sent back for them. Weeks, they said, a couple of months at the most. Hold the camp together, keep the fire going, and a sail would appear on the horizon and take them off this sandbar. Castellan, as far as we can tell, meant it. That is the strange and human core of him. He was an officer of a slave voyage, a man who took part in the whole ugly enterprise, and he was also, apparently, the one Frenchman who genuinely intended to come back. The promise he made on that beach was not entirely a lie. It was a promise he would spend the next 11 years of his life trying to keep, against an administration that did not want to hear it. But on the day the Providence was ready, none of that was known yet. There was only a small, crowded boat, a crew climbing aboard, and 60 or so people standing on the sand, watching the men who had promised to save them get smaller against the sky. The Providence left the island on the 27th of September, 1761, a little under 2 months after the wreck. She carried around 122 men, packed into a boat that had been a pile of salvaged planking a few weeks earlier. It was a dangerous crossing in an untested craft, and it worked. Within a few days, the Providence reached the coast of Madagascar. The French had done the thing they set out to do. They had built their own escape and used it. It had been a close thing. A small, overloaded boat crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean is not a safe bet, and the crossing was hard. But she held together, and she reached Madagascar, and from there, the crew made their way onto Ile-de-France, carrying the story of the wreck and, for a while yet, the memory of the people they had left on the sand. From Madagascar, word and men made their way onward to Ile-de-France, the colony that had ordered the original cargo of human beings in the first place. And here the story of the crew and the story of the abandoned people split apart for good. The crew were home, more or less. They had survived a wreck and an open boat voyage, and they had a tale to tell. The people on the sand had a promise, and a fire, and a horizon they were told to watch. Captain Lafargue did not enjoy his survival for long. The man who had put the Utile on the reef fell ill on the way back, and died of disease before he could be called to account for anything. Whatever reckoning might have followed him, the fever got there first. That left Castellan as the senior surviving officer, and it left him carrying the promise more or less alone. Understand what that promise had become the moment the Providence touched land. On the island it had been a matter of weeks. A quick run back, a ship sent, done. Now it was an item of colonial business. And colonial business moved at the speed of ships and seasons and the moods of officials. A message had to reach the right desk. The right official had to decide the matter was worth a vessel and a crew and the cost of provisioning them. And that official had to want to do it. He did not want to do it. That is the hinge of the entire 15 years, and it is worth being precise about why. Start with the simplest reason, the one that has nothing to do with malice. A rescue voyage costs money. A ship taken off its normal work. A crew paid. food and water loaded, weeks of risk sailing toward a reef that had already destroyed one vessel. All of that spent to retrieve people the colony regarded not as citizens, or even as sailors, but as slaves. In the brutal accounting of the place, the enslaved survivors were a loss already written off. Chasing after a loss is not how a struggling colony balanced its books, and this colony was struggling. In the early 1760s, Ile-de-France was still run by the French East India Company, the same company that owned the Utile, and the company was sliding toward collapse. Its finances were a wreck of their own. Its ships were needed elsewhere. Its officials were managing decline, not looking for expensive errands of conscience in dangerous water. The people on the sandbar were, to that administration, someone else's mistake, made on an illegal voyage, sitting on a rock that had already proven it could kill. Within a few years, the company would be finished, stripped of its trade monopoly, and forced to hand its Indian Ocean islands to the Crown. An organization sliding toward its own collapse does not go hunting for costly acts of mercy at the edge of its map. The very institution that had shipped these people and then stranded them was busy dying, and a dying bureaucracy looks after itself first. The survivors were an expense with no return, attached to a scandal nobody wanted reopened, owned in effect by a company that would soon cease to exist. So the weeks the survivors had been promised became months. The months became a year. On the island, the fire was kept burning, and the horizon stayed empty, and the people who watched it had no way of knowing that the men who could save them had already, quietly, decided not to. There is a document at the center of this chapter, except that the document is mostly an absence. The rescue that was promised generated almost no paper, because, for years, nobody in authority tried to make it happen. We can still reconstruct the shape of the refusal, because Castellan did try, and the friction of his trying left traces. He pressed for a ship. He was, by the reckoning of the man who later excavated the island, very likely the only Frenchman who genuinely worked to get the survivors off that sand. And the answer he met was not a single dramatic no. It was a slow, grinding, bureaucratic version of no, delivered over years. Part of the refusal was money, which we have already seen. Part of it was something worse, and it grew directly out of the way the voyage had begun. Remember that the Utile had been carrying slaves illegally, against the order that ships from Madagascar bring grain to feed the colony. That original crime did not shame the administration into helping the survivors. It did the opposite. It gave the officials a reason to keep their distance. Think it through from behind their desks. To send a ship for these people was to take official notice of them. It was to write their existence into the record, to spend public resources on them, and in doing so, to reopen the awkward question of how they had come to be on that island at all. It meant admitting that a company voyage had broken the company's own rule, wrecked and stranded dozens of illegally traded human beings within reach of the colony, who had then been left there. Far easier to let the whole matter stay vague. Far easier to treat the people on the sand not as a duty, but as a rumor. This is the quiet machinery that keeps people abandoned. Not a villain twirling a mustache. A set of officials, each with reasons, each finding it cheaper and safer to do nothing, passing the discomfort along until it becomes invisible. The people on the island did not need to be actively hated. They only needed to be inconvenient and unrecorded and far away. They were all three, and distance did the rest. It is easy to leave people you never have to look at. The island lay hundreds of miles from the desks that decided its fate. No official who refused the rescue ever stood on that sand, or met the eyes of anyone on it, or watched what refusal actually meant. Cruelty is simplest at a distance, on paper, as a line item. That is exactly where this cruelty lived. Meanwhile, the news did travel, in its way. Word of the castaways reached as far as Paris, and it caused a brief stir among people who thought about such things. But France in the 1760s had louder problems. The 7 Years' War, the great global conflict that would strip France of much of her empire, was consuming attention and money and ships. The East India Company was failing. Against a war that was redrawing the map of the world, 60 forgotten people on a sandbar in the Indian Ocean were a footnote, and footnotes wait. So they waited. 1 year, 2, 5. On the island, the population began to fall, quietly, as the weakest died and were buried in the sand beside the dead from the wreck. And the crucial fact, the one this whole film turns on, settled into place. These people were not being kept from rescue by the ocean. The ocean had done its worst on one night in July, and then let them live. What kept them on that island, year after year, was a decision made by men at desks, in a safe harbor, who had weighed the cost of a ship against the value of these particular lives, and arrived at a number they were comfortable with. That is the reframe this story demands, and it is worth stating flatly before we go any further. The island did not trap them. The paperwork did. Years are easy to say and hard to live. When we write that the survivors waited 15 years, the sentence takes a second. The waiting did not. Turn the calendar slowly for a moment. The Providence sailed in 1761. The 7 Years' War ground on until 1763, and when it ended, France had lost most of her empire in India and North America, and the East India Company that owned the Utile was mortally wounded. In 1767, the French crown took the islands of the Indian Ocean out of the company's failing hands and began running them directly. Governors changed. Clerks changed. The desks that had first refused the rescue were occupied by new men who had never heard of the people on the sand and who had no particular reason to go looking for a problem their predecessors had buried. That is one of the cruelest features of a slow injustice. It outlives the people who begin it. Nobody had to keep deciding, year after year, to abandon these survivors. The decision had been made once, and then it simply sat there, kept in place by inertia, requiring no fresh cruelty from anyone. Each new official inherited a file already closed and found it easier to leave it closed. The abandonment needed no villains after the first year. It only needed a system that never went back to check its own conclusions. Through all of it, one man kept asking. Castellan did not let the matter drop. Over roughly 11 years, he pressed the case wherever he could, to whoever would listen, until eventually his persistence reached a level of the French state high enough to act. Not the local officials who had every reason to look away, but the naval ministry itself. Somewhere in the early 1770s, the order that should have been given in 1761 was finally, grudgingly, approved. A ship could be sent to see whether anyone was still alive. Sit with the arithmetic of that delay, because it is monstrous in a very quiet way. A promise of a few weeks had become 11 years, of one man petitioning a bureaucracy that would rather forget. 11 years. Say it slowly. A child born the year the promise was made would have been most of the way to grown before the state so much as agreed to look. Whole seasons of Castellan's life went into letters and requests and waiting rooms for people he had left on a beach and could not put down. The system had 100 ways to say, "Not now." He had one word, and he kept saying it. Come back for them. And even when the answer finally turned to yes, the sea was not done being cruel. The first attempts to reach the island failed. The same reef and weather that had wrecked the Utile turned back the ships sent to undo her damage. We will come to those failed rescues, because one of them left a strange new castaway on the sand. But the essential point is this. By the time anyone in authority tried to keep Castellan's promise, more than a decade had passed, and nobody in Port Louis or Paris had any idea who, if anyone, was still there to be saved. Which leaves us with the hardest question in the whole story. What actually happened on that island across those years? Who lived, who died, what they built, what they ate, how they held a community together on a sandbar, with no wood and no soil and no help coming. The written record, so careful about muskets and cloth and the price of a slave, goes nearly silent here. The people best placed to tell us, the survivors themselves, left no written testimony, and the ship that finally rescued them lost its records. For a long time, that silence was the end of it. The story survived as a grim anecdote, a footnote about castaways, easy to tell and impossible to verify. Then, 2.5 centuries later, a different kind of investigator went to the island to ask the ground what the paperwork would not say. The man who reopened the case was named Max Guérout. He was a former officer of the French Navy who had become an underwater and naval archaeologist, and in the early 2000s he turned his attention to the Isle of Sand and the people abandoned on it. He began where a careful historian begins, in the archives, from around 2004, gathering the scattered French documents about the Utile, the wreck, and the failed rescues. But he understood the limit of those papers. They could tell him how the disaster started and how the French got away. They could barely tell him anything about the 15 years that were the real heart of the matter. For that, there was only one witness left that had been present the whole time, the island itself. So Guérout organized a series of archaeological expeditions, working with a French research group devoted to naval archaeology and with the National Institute for Rescue Archaeology. Between 2006 and 2013, teams went out to Tromelin for stretches of about 6 weeks at a time, across 4 separate seasons, in 2006, 2008, 2010, and 2013. They dug on a remote coral islet with no natural shade and no fresh surface water, the same conditions that had defined every day of the castaways' lives. And they read the ground like a document. They read the water, too. Part of the early work went into the reef itself, where the Utile had died. Down among the coral, the divers found the scattered remains of the ship, the heavy iron and ballast and fittings that a wooden hull leaves behind when the sea takes the wood. The vessel that had carried these people into disaster was still there, broken across the reef that killed her, a short distance from the settlement her survivors had built. The wreck and the houses were 2 halves of one event, and for the first time, both halves could be examined together. What tied the seasons on the island to the papers in the archive was a single discipline. Every object was recorded exactly where it lay, because in archaeology, the position of a thing is part of what it says. A pot in the kitchen, a bone in the midden, a wall built against the wind. Each one holds its meaning partly in its place. Read carefully. The ground does not merely confirm the old story. It tells a fuller one than any Frenchman ever bothered to write down. This is the part of the story where the method matters as much as the findings. so it is worth slowing down. Archaeology of this kind is not treasure hunting. It is the disciplined reading of what people leave behind when they are not writing anything down. A hearth, a wall, a repaired pot, a heap of butchered bones, the exact place where an object was dropped and never picked up again. Each of these is a sentence in a language of evidence, and unlike a ledger, it has no motive to lie. The company's papers had every reason to minimize the people on that island. The layer of ash and bone and worked copper under the sand had no agenda at all. It simply recorded what happened. The teams also did something that the original voyage never bothered to do. They treated the Malagasy as people with a history and descendants. A Malagasy historian from the University of Antananarivo joined the later expeditions, and before the digging of the season that would disturb human remains, a ceremony was held to ask the permission of the ancestors. Set that beside the ledger from 1761, the one that recorded 160 souls as a single figure of cargo. The distance between those two acts, the lump sum and the ceremony, is the distance this whole field has had to travel. And what the ground gave up, season after season, was not the story the old anecdote had told. The anecdote was about helpless victims clinging to life on a rock. The evidence was about something else. It was about organization. It was about people who did not merely survive on that island, but governed it, built on it, and ran it as a working settlement for 15 years. The reframe the documents had begun, the ground completed. These were not castaways waiting to be saved. They were a society the record had refused to see. The clearest proof of that society is also the simplest. They built houses, real ones out of stone, meant to last. When the archaeologists opened the ground, they did not find the scatter of a desperate camp. They found architecture. The survivors had built with the only materials the island offered. They quarried flat plates of beach sandstone, a rock that forms naturally where coral sand cements together, and they set those plates upright in the ground, like the pages of a book stood on end. On top of that base, they laid blocks of coral. The result was masonry, deliberate and skilled, and in places, the walls were as much as 5 feet thick. Think about what a 5-foot wall means on a treeless sandbar. It does not mean panic. It means planning. A frightened person throws up a lean-to and prays for a sail. These people cut stone and stacked it 1.5 yards deep, which is the kind of thing you build when you have accepted that the sail is not coming soon and you are going to have to live here properly. Every one of those walls is an argument against the idea that they were simply waiting. You do not wait in a fortress you spent months constructing. The settlement was not one hut, but a cluster. The buildings shared walls and stood together, spread across an area of roughly 1/2 acre. That is the footprint of a small hamlet, laid out with some thought. The openings of the buildings were turned away from the direction of the strongest wind, which tells you these builders had studied their island, learned where the weather came from, and designed against it. This is local knowledge, accumulated and applied. It is the behavior of residents, not victims. Consider how they built as well, because the how is its own kind of proof. They had no quarry, no timber, no cement of the ordinary kind, so they used what a coral island offers. They cut natural slabs of hardened beach sand, stood them on edge, and crowned them with blocks of coral, fitting stone to stone without the tools a mason would take for granted. To raise a wall that thick, that stable, in that way, is patient and knowledgeable work. It is not the frantic scraping of people who expect to be gone in a week. It is the craft of people building something they intend to stand, and stand it did. The walls the archaeologists uncovered had outlasted the empire that abandoned their builders, the company that owned them, and every official who declined to send a ship. 2.5 centuries on, the houses were still there in the sand, low and stubborn, holding their shape. The people were gone. Their masonry was not. There is a kind of justice in that, small and stony, and very late, but real, and the island tested those walls. Tromelin lies in a part of the Indian Ocean that cyclones cross. A tropical storm on a flat coral islet is a special kind of terror, because there is no high ground to climb to, and nowhere the water cannot reach. The excavation found evidence that the survivors met this threat head-on. At some point, they raised a long, heavy wall, running around 20 feet, positioned to shield the settlement, most likely built or rebuilt after a cyclone had already shown them what it could do. They were struck, and they answered by building stronger. That sequence, disaster followed by reinforcement rather than collapse, is the signature of a community with a future in mind. There is a quiet devastation folded into all of this competence. Every improvement to the settlement was also a measurement of abandonment. The first shelters were the work of people who expected rescue in weeks. The 5-foot walls and the cyclone barrier belonged to people who had counted the empty horizons and drawn the obvious conclusion. Nobody builds a stone town on a sandbar because they think they are leaving on Tuesday. The better their houses got, the longer they had understood themselves to be alone. So the buildings answer the first big question of the 15 years, the question of shelter, and they answer a larger question at the same time. These people organized themselves. They divided labor. They made plans that spanned seasons. They learned their environment and engineered against it, and they did it with no tools but what a wreck and a reef could provide. The houses in the sand are not a footnote to a survival story. They are the physical proof of a functioning society, built by people the record on the mainland had already written off as a loss. Inside one of those buildings, an oval structure the archaeologists identified as a kitchen, the ground held something even more intimate than walls. It held the daily objects of a life, about 45 of them gathered in that single space, and among them was the closest thing these people left to a written diary. It was made of copper. When the Utile broke up, her galley gear washed ashore, and copper was among the most precious things the survivors salvaged, because copper can be worked cold, cut, bent, and joined without a proper forge. Over 15 years they used it, and used it, and used it, until it wore through. And when it wore through, they mended it. This is where the evidence becomes almost unbearably human. The archaeologists found copper vessels that had been repaired, and then repaired again, some of them patched as many as 8 separate times over the years. The technique was consistent and clever. They would cut a patch from another piece of copper, drill holes through both the patch and the worn vessel, then make tiny rivets by rolling small strips of copper and hammering them home to lock the patch in place. It is real metalworking, the sort of skill that takes patience to learn and steadier patience to keep doing when the same pot fails for the 6th time and you have no new pot and no hope of one. Count the repairs and you are counting time. A cooking vessel mended 8 times across 15 years is a calendar. Each patch marks a stretch of months when that pot was the only pot, when losing it would have meant a real blow to a group already living at the edge. The copper does what no French document bothered to do. It records the passage of the years from the inside, one repair at a time, in the hand of the people actually living them. The kitchen held more than pots. There were around 15 spoons, and they too show the same inventive economy. Each was cut from copper, with small wings left at the base, and those wings were folded around a twig to make a handle. There were iron tripods to stand cooking vessels over the fire. There were large bowls beaten out of lead that the ship had carried in flat sheets to patch her hull, now serving as basins on the island she died beside. Nothing was wasted. Everything the wreck gave was turned to use and reused until it could be used no more. Waste is a luxury of people who can get more. These people could not get more. So a torn sheet of lead became a bowl. A spent tool became the stock for the next one. The wreck of the Utile was the only shop on the island, and it had already closed for good. Whatever they would ever own, they already owned. The rest was care and cleverness and time. And then there are the objects that were not about survival at all. Among the finds were rings, bracelets, and pendants, ornaments worked from the same salvaged metal. This detail deserves a pause, because it breaks the frame of the survival story completely. People fighting merely to stay alive do not, as a rule, make jewelry. The presence of ornament means these people had crossed back over from bare endurance into something like culture. They marked themselves. They made things that were beautiful as well as useful. On a sandbar at the far edge of everyone else's map, they insisted on being people, not just bodies keeping their hearts beating. There was even a comb, of the kind used to untangle long hair. Enslaved people were often shorn, their hair cut short as a mark of their status. A comb for long hair suggests that on this island, cut off from the masters who had defined them as property, the survivors let their hair grow back. It is a small object with a large meaning. Away from the people who owned them, they reclaimed a piece of themselves that ownership had taken. The comb is not a tool of survival. It is a tool of identity. Hold one of those repaired pots in your mind for a moment. Its body is the original copper from the Utile's galley. Across it run the patches, each a small square of metal cut from something else, each fixed with rivets a person rolled and hammered by hand. One patch might be from the 2nd year, another from the 7th, another from near the end. A single object layered with the marks of a decade of use, each layer added by someone who woke up on that island and decided, again, to keep the household going. No French clerk recorded those years. The pot did. Put the copper and the lead and the spoons and the rings and the comb together, and you have the diary these people were never allowed to write. It says, in objects rather than words, that they cooked and ate and organized and endured, that they kept their skills sharp and their dignity intact, and that they did all of it for year upon year, while the men who could have ended it decided the cost was too high. Two things had to be true every single day, or everyone died. There had to be water. There had to be fire. Everything else on the island was negotiable. These were not. Start with water, because it was the more merciless of the two. Tromelin has no stream and no spring. Rain falls, but not reliably, and a flat island sheds it fast. So the survivors dug. They sank a well down into the sand, going about 5 meters deep, roughly the height of a house, until they reached water they could drink. That well is one of the most telling objects on the whole island. It is not a thing you scratch out in an afternoon of panic. It is a serious excavation, dug by hand, maintained for years, deep enough to reach the fresh water that floats in a thin lens beneath a coral island. Now hold that image. People with almost nothing, on a rock in the middle of the ocean, dug a shaft the depth of a small building, through sand that keeps collapsing, and they kept it open and clean for all 15 years. The well did not maintain itself. Someone tended it. Someone made sure it did not foul, did not cave in, did not run dry in the bad seasons. That is daily, unglamorous, life or death labor, repeated thousands of times, by people whose names we will never know. Then there was fire. On an island with no forest, keeping a fire alive for 15 years is its own quiet miracle. Wood was scarce. What they had came from the wreck of the Utile and from whatever driftwood the sea delivered, and both were finite. The archaeologists found the tools of fire-making in the ground, pieces of flint and the steel struck against them to throw a spark. So the survivors could, in principle, relight a fire that went out. But you did not want to test that on a wet night with the last of your tinder soaked. The safer thing, the thing a careful community would do, was never to let the fire die at all. Picture that as a duty passed around a group, a fire that must not go out, through rain, through storm, through the long nights when the wind comes off the water and there is nothing to burn but the plank you were saving. Someone always awake, someone always feeding it. For 15 years, the fire was the kitchen and the warmth and the signal and the center of the settlement, and it burned only because human beings chose, night after night, to keep it burning. There is a hard irony buried in that fire, and it is worth naming. A fire is also a signal. For 15 years there was smoke rising off that island, by day a smudge against the sky, exactly the sort of thing a passing ship might notice. The problem was that almost no ships passed. The island sat off the shipping routes, on a reef captains avoided, which was part of why no one came. The survivors kept a fire lit over an empty sea, year upon year, for no eyes at all. The fire that kept them alive was also, in a sense, a message no one was there to read, and the nights were long. A coral island in the middle of the ocean gets cold after dark, the wind coming off the water with nothing to break it. The fire was warmth against that, and light against the dark, and the one fixed point in a place that offered no others. To lose it was not only to lose the means of cooking, it was to lose the center the whole community was built around. So it was guarded the way you guard the single thing you cannot do without, by never, across 5,000 nights, letting it fall to ash. Water from a well they dug and guarded. Fire they refused to let die. These are not the acts of people waiting passively for the end. They are the acts of people running an island, and doing it well, on the assumption that survival was their own job and no one else's. In that assumption they were, tragically, correct. An island with no crops and no livestock still has to feed its people. Tromelin fed its people mostly on birds, and the ground remembers this in the plainest possible way. Bones. When the archaeologists sifted the settlement in the season of 2013, they recovered and studied something on the order of 18,000 bird bones. 18,000. That is not a stray meal here and there. That is an industry. The birds in question were seabirds, chiefly the sooty tern, which once came to nest on Tromelin in enormous numbers. For part of the year, the sky over the island would fill with them, and with their eggs, and the survivors harvested that abundance hard. But a bird colony is seasonal, and this is the cruel rhythm the survivors lived inside. When the terns came to breed, there was food, a glut of it, meat and eggs together. When the terns left, that food left with them. So the year on Tromelin was not a steady line. It was a feast, followed by a long, lean stretch, again and again, and the survivors had to store, ration, and endure through the empty months. Fishing, which you might think would fill the gap, was difficult from the island. The reef that killed the Utile also made the water treacherous, and the accounts suggest fish were a harder catch than the birds. This is the kind of pressure that quietly decides who lives. A community that eats well for 3 months and then faces 9 hard ones has to think ahead or die. It has to preserve food when there is a surplus, ration it through the lean stretch, and hold its discipline when hunger argues against the plan. That the settlement lasted 15 years means they solved this problem, season after season, with no granary and no help. It is one more piece of evidence for the same conclusion the walls and the well already point to. These were not people barely hanging on by luck. They were people running a hard place with real competence. 18,000 bones is also a measurement of time and of numbers. It is the residue of countless meals eaten by a shrinking group across 15 years. Every one of those bones was a bird, caught by hand or snare, plucked, and cooked over the fire that someone kept burning. The feathers did not go to waste either. The survivors plaited them into cloth. What they wore, in the end, was made from the same birds they ate, garments of woven feathers against the sun and the night wind. Nothing the island offered was allowed to go unused. And then there was the turtle, and with the turtle we reach one of the most quietly wrenching facts in the entire record. Green sea turtles came to Tromelin. A turtle is a great deal of meat, far more than a bird, and for a starving community it was survival on a scale a tern could not match. So the survivors ate turtle. That sentence sounds simple. It was not. For some Malagasy communities, the turtle was forbidden food, a thing not eaten, a taboo, deep and old, the kind of prohibition that sits at the center of who a people understand themselves to be. And on that island, cut off from home, some of these people almost certainly broke that taboo in order to live. They ate the forbidden thing because the alternative was to starve. Sit with what that means. Survival on Tromelin was not only a matter of thirst and hunger and weather. It cost people pieces of their own identity. To stay alive, some of them had to do the one thing their culture told them never to do, and then do it again the next season and the next. The record cannot tell us how they felt about it, and I will not pretend to know. But the fact is there in the ground, in the turtle remains beside the bird bones, and it is a harder kind of suffering than mere hardship. It is the suffering of being forced to choose between your body and your beliefs, over and over, with no good answer. And they chose their bodies, because they had to. Judge that however you like. They had not come there by choice. They had been stolen, shipped, wrecked, and abandoned. Then they were handed one last indignity, the daily choice, to break a piece of themselves in order to keep breathing. That is not a failure of faith. It is what happens when people are pushed past the last line the world usually lets anyone reach, and told to survive anyway. This is what the survival stories tend to leave out when they turn Tromelin into an adventure. The island did not just test whether these people could stay alive. It made them pay for staying alive in a currency that went far beyond the physical. Water from a well, fire from a spark, meat from a bird, and, when the birds were gone, meat from a creature they had been raised never to touch. Every day alive was bought, and some of the prices did not show up on any bone or in any wall. They showed up inside the people, where the excavation cannot reach. The evidence cannot give us a diary, but it can give us the shape of an ordinary day. That shape is worth walking through, because ordinary days are what these 15 years were actually made of. It would have begun with the fire. Someone had carried it through the night, feeding it scraps of wreck timber and driftwood so that it never went dark. By first light, that flame was already the center of everything, the place where the day's food was cooked, and the point the whole settlement was arranged around. Water came next, and water was labor. The well ran down about 5 meters through loose sand, and drawing from it, keeping it clean, keeping its walls from slumping, was not a single achievement, but a daily chore. On a coral island, the fresh water sits in a thin layer above the salt, easily spoiled. Someone had to guard that boundary every day, or the whole community lost its throat. Then food, and food followed the birds. When the terns were nesting, the work was harvest, catching birds and gathering eggs in the season of plenty, more than could be eaten at once, which meant the further work of preserving against the lean months to come. When the terns were gone, the same hours turned to rationing what had been stored and to the thin returns of a difficult reef, a community that ate its way through something like 18,000 birds, did it one caught meal at a time. Around all of that ran the endless small work of keeping things whole. A copper pot split at the seam and had to be patched, again, with a cut square of metal and a hammered rivet. A wall loosened by wind had to be reset. A feather garment wore through and had to be rewoven. Nothing could be bought and nothing replaced from outside. So everything was mended, and mended again, and the mending never stopped. The objects in the ground are worn precisely because this labor never let up. And there was building. The stone houses did not appear overnight. They rose course by course over months and improved over years, as the survivors accepted that this was not a camp to be struck the day rescue came, but a place they had to make truly livable. Notice what is missing from this day. There is no master telling anyone what to do. There is no owner taking the product of the labor, no overseer, no plantation bell. For the first time in the lives of many of these people, the work of the day was their own, done to keep themselves and each other alive, rather than to enrich a man who called them property. It was brutally hard. It was also, in a bitter and unchosen way, the nearest thing to freedom the century ever handed them. The day ended where it started, at the fire, with someone taking the watch. Multiply that single day by 365, and then by 15, and you begin to grasp what these people actually did. Not one heroic act of survival, but roughly 5,000 ordinary days, each one earned, each one built from water and fire and birds and stone, on an island the rest of the world had agreed to forget. Here is a question the survival stories almost never ask. Who was in charge? For 15 years, this settlement worked. The fire stayed lit, the wells stayed open, the buildings went up and were repaired. Food was gathered, stored, and shared through seasons of plenty and seasons of nothing. None of that happens by accident. A group of frightened individuals does not keep a fire burning for 15 unbroken years. A community with some kind of order does. And this community had no masters. The moment the Providence sailed, every Frenchman who had claimed to own these people was gone. There was no captain, no overseer, no colonial state, no law, but whatever the survivors made among themselves. The very people who had been defined their whole lives as property, as things to be directed by others, were suddenly responsible for governing themselves on the hardest ground imaginable. The record does not give us their politics. We have no names of leaders, no account of how decisions were made, no story of who settled a dispute or who assigned the night watch on the fire. That silence is real, and I will not fill it with invention. But the archaeology lets us say one thing with confidence. Whatever they did, it worked, and it worked for 15 years. The order was real, even though the record of it is gone. There is one more pattern in the evidence, and it is striking. At the end, of the 8 people rescued, 7 were women. The last long-surviving society on Tromelin was mostly female. We should be careful about why. But the shape of the story offers a strong hint. The most dangerous thing a person could do on that island was try to leave it. The escape attempts, the rafts launched into open ocean toward a horizon hundreds of miles away, were acts of desperate courage that mostly ended in death. And those attempts seem to have been made disproportionately by the men. The men took the great risks and were swallowed by the sea. The women stayed and endured and kept the settlement alive. Endurance is its own kind of courage, quieter than a raft and far more successful. There is something worth pausing on in that. Every one of these people had been captured, sold, and defined for life as property, as a body whose choices belonged to someone else. On the island, for the first time, the choices were theirs. Who would draw water and who would hunt? How the birds would be shared in a lean season, when to build, when to rest, how to settle the inevitable friction of frightened people packed onto half an acre of sand. They made those decisions themselves, and they made them well enough to last 15 years. The people the empire had judged incapable of running their own lives ran an entire island, competently, for longer than most ministries survive. The judgment had always been a lie. Here, in the hardest possible test, the lie was exposed, though no one with power was there to see it. So the picture that emerges, held gently because the record is thin, is of a community that outlasted its own masters, governed itself without any of the authority it had always been denied, and in its final years rested on the shoulders of women who chose the long, grinding work of staying alive over the gamble of the open sea. The people the ledger had called property ran a functioning society longer than many governments last. They just did it where no one was looking, and left no minutes of the meetings. Now the hardest counting in the story. Not how they lived, how many did not. Begin with the number we started with, and remember how soft it always was. Somewhere between 60 and 80 Malagasy people reached the sand after the wreck. We could never be more precise than that, because they were never properly counted in the first place. Set that fuzzy figure at one end of the 15 years. At the other end stands a hard, exact number. 8, 7 women and a baby. Between those two numbers lies the whole silent tragedy. Most of the people who survived the wreck did not survive the abandonment. The man who excavated the island believed that the majority of the 60 to 80 died within the first couple of years. The early years were the killing years. Why the beginning and not the end? Think about it, and the logic is grim but clear. The first years were when the wounds of the wreck were still fresh, when the shock was heaviest, when the settlement was not yet built and the systems for water and food were not yet perfected. The first years were also when hope was highest and its collapse most crushing. They had been promised weeks. As the weeks became months and the months became a second year with no sail, the weakest and the most despairing did not make it through. The people who survived into the later years were, in a sense, the hardened remainder of a much larger group that the island had already taken. Some did not die on the island. They left it. Early on, a group of around 18 people put out from Tromelin on some kind of craft, trying to cross to a world they could not see. None of them was ever heard from again. Whether they drowned within sight of the island or made land somewhere and vanished into history, no record tells us. Add them to the column of the lost, with a question mark that will never be answered, and here the counting fails completely, which is the point. We do not know the names of the dead. We do not know exactly how many there were. We cannot list them, cannot mark their graves, because the graves themselves are mostly gone, scattered and built over on an island where the living had no choice but to make their homes on top of the dead. The archaeologists, digging with great care, recovered only a small number of human remains, reburied with a ceremony, the original abandonment never granted. This is the final cruelty of treating people as a total instead of a list. When they die, they cannot even be mourned by name, because their names were never written down. The Utile's papers could tell you the price of the muskets traded at Foulpointe to the last coin. They cannot tell you the name of a single one of the dozens of human beings who died slowly on that sandbar. The record kept the things and lost the people. That was not a failure of the record, it was the purpose of it. By the early 1770s, after all of Castellan's pleading, the answer from the French state finally turned. A ship would go. But wanting to reach Tromelin and reaching it turned out to be two very different things. The same features that had doomed the Utile now defended the island against its would-be rescuers. Tromelin is ringed by a reef and sits in difficult water, low and hard to see, dangerous to approach. A captain sent to save the castaways had to weigh his orders against the real chance of joining them, of putting his own ship on the same coral. More than one attempt was made in these years. More than one attempt failed, turned back by the reef, the surf, and the weather. There is a special agony in a rescue that almost happens. For the officials in Port Louis, a failed attempt could be filed and forgotten. A line about bad conditions, try again another season. For anyone still alive on the island, a ship that appeared and then withdrew was a different thing entirely. We do not know how many of these near misses the survivors saw, but imagine the ones they did. A sail on the horizon, after years of empty sea, the thing you have kept the fire burning for, and then it turns and shrinks and is gone, and you are still there. The reef also handed the rescuers a ready excuse. A captain could report, quite truthfully, that the approach was too dangerous, the surf wrong, the season against him. Each report was reasonable on its own terms. Stacked together across several years, they produced exactly the outcome the flat refusals had produced a decade earlier. The people stayed on the island. The only difference now was that the failure could be laid at the feet of the weather rather than the conscience. Both kinds of failure cost the same thing: time. And time was the one resource the survivors did not have. Every season lost to a turned-back ship was another season of the slow subtraction that had been thinning them from the start. Approval on paper meant nothing to a woman on that sand. Only a boat that actually landed would count. And no boat had. Each failure also burned time the survivors could not spare. Every season that a rescue was approved, but not achieved, was another turn of the killing arithmetic. Another stretch in which the small remaining group could lose one of its own and drop closer to nothing. The state had finally said yes. The sea kept saying no, and in the gap between those two answers, more of the abandoned ran out of years. It is worth holding the full absurdity of the situation in view. A promise made in 1761, a decade of official refusal. Then, when the refusal finally softened, several years more lost to failed attempts against a reef. The people on Tromelin were failed twice over, first by men who would not send a ship, then by the ocean, which would not let the ships through. Only the second failure can be blamed on nature. The first was entirely a choice. One of those failed attempts left behind a strange and telling detail. In the course of trying to reach the island, a ship put a French sailor onto the sand, who then could not get back off it. The accounts vary in the particulars, but the core is consistent. During a rescue effort in the mid-1770s, a vessel that could not safely land nonetheless got a man ashore, and when the ship was driven off, that man was stranded. A Frenchman, a member of the side that was supposed to be doing the saving, suddenly found himself a castaway among the very people he had come to rescue. Consider the reversal. For years, these Malagasy survivors had watched the horizon for men like him, men from the world of ships and rescue and the French colonial order. Now one of those men was living in their settlement, drinking from their well, warming himself at their fire, eating their birds, entirely dependent on the society they had built. The people the empire had abandoned were now keeping one of the empire's own sailors alive. There is a lesson in that reversal. It is not a gentle one. The whole colonial order rested on a single claim, that some people were fit to command and others only fit to be owned. The island tested that claim directly. A man from the ruling side was stripped of his ship and his rank and set down on the sand. He did not take charge. He survived, because the people his world had written off knew how to keep a human being alive in that place, and he did not. Competence had never followed the line the trade was built on. It had only ever followed knowledge, and the knowledge on that island belonged to the abandoned. By the survivors' own later account, the arrival of this sailor changed their number. Where the group had held at around 13 for a long stretch, the stranded Frenchman made 14. That is one of the few glimpses we get of their internal count, a figure remembered and reported, and it tells us how small the community had become. After more than a decade, a group that had started at 60 to 80 was measured in the low teens. The sailor did not stay a castaway forever, and what he did next pulled several of the survivors into the sea with him, because after so many years, and with rescue proving it could not or would not come by ship, a handful of the people on Tromelin made one last decision to save themselves. Around this time, the small community grew by one in the oldest way. A child was born on the island. For a group that had spent well over a decade watching its numbers only fall, a birth was an extraordinary thing. It meant that even here, even now, life was still insisting on itself. But the arrival of the stranded sailor seems to have reopened an old temptation. He was a mariner. He knew boats, and the idea of building a craft and making a run for it, of not waiting one more empty season for a rescue that had failed so many times, took hold of part of the group. So they built a raft, they rigged it with a sail, and the material they used for that sail tells you how completely they had learned to live off this island. The sail was woven from feathers, from the same seabirds that fed and clothed them. Then a party of them, 3 men and 3 women, together with the French sailor, pushed off from Tromelin into the open Indian Ocean, aiming for a coast none of them could see. They were never heard from again. Maybe they drowned within a day. Maybe they lasted longer. Maybe Though it is almost too much to hope, one of them touched land somewhere and lived out a life that left no record. We will never know. The sea that had already taken the group of 18 years before took these 7 as well, or if it did not, history lost them just as thoroughly. What that raft left behind was the final community of Tromelin. When the men and the sailor were gone, the people remaining on the island numbered 8, 7 women, and the infant. That is who was left. A handful of women who had outlasted the wreck, the abandonment, the killing early years, the failed rescues, and now the departure of the last people willing to gamble on the sea. They did not gamble. They stayed by the fire and the well and the stone houses, and they kept going. Think about the courage in staying. From a distance it looks passive. It was not. Every day they chose the island over the raft was a day they chose slow, uncertain hope over fast, near certain death. They had watched others take the gamble and vanish. They did not follow. They bet on endurance instead, and in the end, for 7 women and 1 child, endurance was the bet that paid. They had no way of knowing that this time, the horizon was finally about to keep its promise. On the 29th of November, 1776, a ship called the Dauphine came to Tromelin, and this time got through. She was a French naval corvette, and she was commanded by a young officer named Jacques-Marie Boudin de Tromelin. Hold that name, because it is the one that stuck to the island. The reef that had turned back earlier rescuers let the Dauphine close enough this time, and her captain managed what 15 years of French officialdom had failed to do. He reached the people on the sand. Think about what he would have seen as he approached. Not an empty islet. Smoke. A fire. Burning as it had burned for 15 years. Sending its thin signal up over an ocean that had ignored it the whole time. The signal fire the survivors had guarded through every storm, the message no ship had been there to read, was finally read. The thing that had kept them alive from the inside now, at the very end, announced them to the outside. There is a terrible economy in that. For 15 years the fire had been both their survival and their signal. For 15 years the signal had gone unread. Not because it was faint, because no one was looking. The smoke had always been legible. The message was never the problem. The problem was an ocean of indifference between the island and anyone who could act. When the Dauphine finally came, nothing about the fire had changed. What changed was that a ship was, at last, pointed the right way. And then the people themselves. The accounts describe survivors who were emaciated, worn down to almost nothing by their years on the island. 7 women, and a baby, 8 months old, alive. The same impossible child this whole story opened with. A healthy infant on an island that every map called empty. Proof in a single small body that this had been not a wreck site, but a home. That people had gone on living and being born here long after everyone able to help had given up on them. There is a promise that gets kept in this moment, and it is worth being exact about the strangeness of it. The promise to come back was made in 1761 by the crew of the Utile, above all by Castellan, who then spent 11 years pushing a reluctant state to honor it. But the man who actually stepped onto the sand and kept that promise, 15 years later, was a stranger to it. Tromelin had not made the promise. He simply carried it out. The vow that saved these women was made by men most of them never saw again, honored at last by a man who had nothing to do with the wreck, after the ones who made it had mostly moved on with their lives. For the 7 women and the child, The 15 years ended in the space of a single day. They gathered what they were, or perhaps nothing at all, and they walked down to the water and off the island that had been their entire world for longer than the youngest adults among them could clearly remember. Behind them, they left the stone houses, the deep well, the graves of everyone who had not made it, and a fire that, with no one to feed it, would finally be allowed to go out. The Dauphine turned for Isle de France, carrying the last 8 people of Tromelin toward a world that had spent 15 years deciding they were not worth the trip. When the survivors reached Isle de France, something happened that had not happened to them in their entire lives. They were set free. By 1776, the mood around slavery had shifted just enough, and the circumstances of these particular people were strange enough that they were freed on arrival rather than delivered into bondage. After everything, the women who had built a civilization on a sandbar did not step off the Dauphine into a plantation. They stepped off it as free people. It is the one piece of grace in the whole account, and it is real, and it should be said clearly. But look closely at how they entered the free world, because freedom came wrapped in one more act of erasure. They were baptized, and in being baptized, they were renamed. The record of that ceremony gives us almost the only individual names we have from the entire story, and every one of them is a French name, laid over a Malagasy life. The baby, the 8-month-old boy from the island, was christened Moses. His mother was given the name Eve. An older woman, remembered as the grandmother, was named Dauphine, after the very ship that had carried them off. A colonial official, a steward named Maillard, took the little family into his household. It is a small mercy inside a large wrong. Both things are true at once. A man opened his home to a mother and child who had nothing. That was kind. It was also the act of a society that could show private warmth to the very people its system had ruined, and feel no contradiction in it. The steward's kindness and the administration's indifference came from the same colony, in the same years. One did not cancel the other. They simply sat side by side, the way they usually do. There is one detail here that breaks the heart precisely because it survived. The mother, the woman renamed Eve, had a Malagasy name, and it was written down, Semi-Avu. It is said to mean the one who is not proud. For a moment, in the baptismal record, the erasure slips, and a real person looks back at us through her own language, named by her own people, before any Frenchman decided what to call her. One name, out of dozens and dozens of human beings across 15 years. One. Weigh what this moment actually is. These people were freed, and that matters. And in the same act, at the very threshold of their freedom, their names were taken and French ones given, their story folded into the categories of the people who had failed them. Moses, Eve, Dauphine. Good names, kindly meant, perhaps, but they are the names of the rescuers, not the rescued. Even liberation arrived as a kind of overwriting. The island had not been able to erase these people. The paperwork of freedom finished part of the job. The paperwork of slavery had begun. Still, they walked off that ship free. Hold on to that. After the wreck, the abandonment, the dead, the rafts, and the years, 8 people reached land and were told they belonged to no one. It is the thinnest possible thread of grace. It is the only one the story offers. They took it. And then, almost at once, the record closes over them again. We know the survivors were freed. We know a handful of the names given to them at baptism. After that, the trail simply ends. The other survivors settled somewhere in Mauritius, and nothing else is known of their lives. It is tempting to picture happier endings for them, and perhaps some of those endings were real. Freedom in Mauritius was not nothing. Perhaps the woman renamed Eve raised her son in a home of her own. Perhaps the older woman lived out her years among people who understood what she had come through. The honest answer is that we cannot say, because no one judged the later lives of these particular free women worth recording. The same indifference that had left them on the island followed them into their freedom and closed over them there as well. Not what work they did, not who they loved, not when they died, not where they are buried. The women who had governed an island for the better part of a decade vanish back into the same silence that had swallowed everyone else. It gets worse. From the point of view of anyone trying to recover the truth, the testimony of the 7 women was not preserved. Whatever they said about their 15 years, whatever they remembered of the wreck and the abandonment and the dead and the rafts, was not written down in any form that survived. On top of that, the records of the Dauphine, the ship that rescued them, were themselves lost. The single richest source we could have had, the direct account of the people who lived it, is gone. Stop and feel the full weight of that. The people best able to tell this story were rescued and freed and then allowed to disappear so completely that we cannot even follow them to their graves. The story you are hearing survives almost in spite of them, assembled from a wrecked ship's paperwork, a stubborn officer's petitions, and, above all, the objects they left in the sand. This is why the archaeology matters as much as it does. It is not a colorful addition to a story we already knew. It is very nearly the only witness that could not be silenced. When the documents fall quiet and the survivors are lost and the rescue ship's log is gone, the well is still 5 meters deep, the walls are still 5 feet thick, the copper is still patched 8 times, and the 18,000 bird bones are still lying exactly where 15 years of meals left them. The people were erased. The ground was not. And the ground, in the end, is what forced them back into history. Step back from the island for a moment and look at the ocean around it, because the Utile was one ship, and she was carrying a cargo that was anything but unusual. Ile-de-France and Bourbon, the 2 colonies at the heart of this story, ran on slavery. That was not a dark corner of the enterprise. It was the enterprise. The coffee and the grain and the sugar, the harbors and the roads and the houses of the planters, all of it rested on the forced labor of people shipped in from somewhere else. And the somewhere else was, above all, Madagascar, along with the East African coast and, further off, India. The ships went out, the ships came back full, season after season, decade after decade. The numbers are staggering, and they are worth stating plainly. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, these small islands took in enslaved people not in the hundreds, not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands. An entire imported population, worked and replaced and imported again, because the plantations consumed lives faster than they could hold them. The 160 souls loaded onto the Utile at Foulpointe were a single ordinary line in a ledger that ran for generations. Now here is the point that makes Tromelin matter far beyond its own sad story. Almost none of that vast crime is visible to us the way Tromelin is. The overwhelming majority of the people carried on those ships left no wreck, no excavation, no settlement in the sand. They left, at most, a number in a register, and very often not even a name attached to it. The trade was built to be invisible in exactly this way. It counted people as totals, as freight, as value. precisely so that no one would ever have to reckon with them one by one. Tromelin is the exception, and it is an exception by accident. A ship happened to wreck. People happened to be abandoned in a dry, remote place where the sand preserved what they built. And 2.5 centuries on, someone happened to come and dig. Every one of those accidents had to line up for us to see these 60 to 80 people at all. Change any of them, and Tromelin would be as blank to us as the thousands of other voyages, a line in a book, a cargo delivered. So think of this island as a single lit window in an enormous darkened building. Through that one window we can see, in real detail, what the trade actually did to real people. We can see the skill and the suffering, the well and the graves, the 8 who lived and the many who did not. And knowing that this one room was full of people forces an honest conclusion about all the rooms we cannot see into. Behind every anonymous number in those ledgers stood people exactly as real, as capable, as grievously wronged as the women of Tromelin. We just have no window to look through. That is the quiet challenge the island throws at anyone who studies it. It is easy to feel the weight of 60 to 80 named in the aggregate people on one small sandbar. It is much harder to hold the weight of the hundreds of thousands who left no sandbar at all, whose whole existence in the record is a tally mark in a column. Tromelin does not let you round them off. Once you have seen what one such group actually built and endured, the tally marks stop being numbers. They start being people you were simply never allowed to meet. There is a bitter irony sitting on top of all this, and it belongs on Ile-de-France itself. In the very years the survivors were being left to their fate, a young Frenchman named Bernardin de Saint-Pierre lived on that island. He watched what slavery did there, and he was horrified by it. And a few years later, he published his account and condemned the whole system in print. The same small colony whose administration could not be bothered to send a ship for the people on Tromelin also produced one of the era's clear voices against the cruelty it was built on. The knowledge that it was wrong was available. It was written down and published. It simply did not change what the ships kept doing. That is the uncomfortable thing the island leaves us with. Knowing better is not the same as doing better. The people who ran this trade were not, for the most part, monsters who had never heard the case against it. They had heard it. Some had made it themselves. And the ships sailed anyway, because the money was real, and the victims were far away, and the record kept them faceless. Tromelin is what that arrangement looked like when the sand, just once, refused to keep the secret. That gap between what people knew and what they allowed is the real subject hiding inside this story. Tromelin is not a freak event at the edge of history. It is the ordinary crime of an entire ocean, made visible for once, because the sand happened to keep the evidence. Look at a map of the Indian Ocean today, and you will find the island. It is there, a tiny dot north of Mauritius, and it has a name, Tromelin. That name is not Malagasy. It does not belong to any of the 60 to 80 people who were abandoned there, or the 8 who walked off alive, or the dozens who died in the sand. Tromelin is the name of the French naval officer who showed up at the very end and took the survivors off. He was on the island for a matter of hours. They were on it for 15 years. The map remembers him. This is how memory usually works, and it is worth naming the pattern out loud. We name places for the people who arrive, who discover, who plant the flag and file the report. The people who were already there, who endured, who did the living and the dying, tend to go unnamed. The officer gets an island. The women get a line in a baptism register, under names that were not even their own. 15 years of survival, governed and built and paid for in the hardest currency there is, and the label on the whole thing honors the man who was present for the last afternoon. It fits everything else we have seen. These people were counted as a total at Foulpointe. They were left as a total by the administration. They were buried as a total in the sand. They were renamed at their baptism. And the island itself, the one piece of the earth that was entirely theirs for 15 years, carries the name of a stranger. At every stage, the record found a way to keep them from being fully themselves. But a name is not destiny, and this is where the story finally begins to turn back the other way. Because in recent decades, people decided that the total was not good enough, that the anonymous cargo deserved to be seen as people, that an island named for its rescuer should also, at last, be made to speak for the rescued. The archaeologists who went to dig did not call their work the Tromelin Project, after the officer. They called it the Mission of the Forgotten Slaves. The naming was deliberate. It put the abandoned, not the finder, at the center of the story. It insisted that the point of going back was not to celebrate a rescue, but to recover the people who had spent 15 years being erased. That impulse is part of something larger. In recent decades, France has slowly, unevenly, begun to face the slavery in its own past, rather than filing it away. Laws have recognized the trade as the crime it was. The objects lifted from Tromelin have traveled to exhibitions, where visitors stand in front of a mended copper pot and a handful of coral stones, and understand, sometimes for the first time, that the trade was not an abstraction, but a thing done to specific people. The excavation gave the abandoned something the 18th century never offered them: an audience, a public willing, at last, to look. None of it can reach the people themselves. They are long dead. Most of them died within sight of the wreck. The looking comes far too late to help a single one of them, but it is not nothing. To be seen, even centuries on, is the exact opposite of what was done to them. They were made invisible on purpose. Making them visible again is a way of saying that the purpose was wrong. The island still carries the officer's name on the map. The history is quietly taking it back for the women who actually lived there. So what, in the end, do we actually know? It is worth being honest about both halves of the answer, the part the ground gave us and the part it never can. Here is what the evidence establishes, and it is a great deal. About 60 to 80 people survived the wreck of the Utile and were left on this island. They did not merely cling to life. They dug a well 5 meters deep and kept it. They built houses of coral and sandstone with walls 5 feet thick and raised a barrier against the cyclones. They kept a fire burning for 15 years. They cooked on copper they mended 8 times over, ate their way through some 18,000 birds, and wove their clothes from feathers. They made rings and a comb. They governed themselves with no masters, buried their dead, and at the end were mostly women. 8 of them, 7 women, and an 8-month-old child, walked off that island alive in 1776 and were freed. All of that is not legend. It is dug up, measured, and catalogued. It happened. None of it asks for a leap of faith. You can hold the copper, you can measure the well, you can count the bones. The part of the story that is easiest to doubt, that people could live here at all, is the part the evidence proves most completely. And here is what we will never know, which is just as important to say. We do not know their names, save one. We do not know how many died, or exactly when, or of what. We do not know what happened to the 18 who left early, or the 6 who set out on the last raft with the stranded sailor, or the 7 freed women once the record let go of them. We do not know how they organized themselves, who led, who loved whom, what they believed, what they said to each other in the long, empty years. The ground kept the shape of their lives with astonishing fidelity. It could not keep their voices. Those are gone, and no excavation will bring them back. Sit with both of those lists, the known and the lost, and the real meaning of the story comes clear. This was never mainly a tale about whether human beings could survive on a sandbar. They could, and did, and the how of it is extraordinary. The deeper story is about what it takes to survive being decided against, being weighed as a line in a ledger against the cost of a ship and found not worth it. Again and again, for 15 years, by men who were never in any danger themselves. The island did not do this to them. The island was only sand and birds and weather. What kept them there was a decision, made and remade in comfortable rooms, to treat these particular people as a loss already written off. The sea wrecked them in a night. The paperwork abandoned them for a decade and a half. And then the same habit of mind that had counted them as freight very nearly finished the job by letting them slip out of history entirely, unnamed and unrecorded, the way the trade intended all along. They did not slip out. That is the one victory in it. The fire they kept was finally seen. The promise, made by men who sailed away and honored 11 years later by a stranger, was finally kept, and the diary they were never allowed to write, in copper and coral and bone, was finally read, by people who came not to save them, because they were long past saving, but to make sure they were counted at last as what they always were, not cargo, not a total. People who built a world on the worst ground imaginable and held it for 15 years. The little that survives of them as individuals is almost nothing, and it is everything. A baby renamed Moses, a grandmother renamed Dauphine, after the ship, and one woman whose own name someone troubled to write down before it could be lost. Semiavu, the one who is not proud. Of all the dozens who lived and died on that island, she is the single person we can still call by the name her own people gave her. One name, kept almost by accident, standing in for everyone the record threw away. The well is still there in the sand. The walls are still standing. The name on the map still belongs to the man who came for a day. But the woman who kept her name, and the fire, and the child who was born where no one was supposed to be alive, belong to the island now, and to anyone willing to look past the total and see the people it was hiding.